Hello, I'm Ian and welcome to the third in a series of videos that I've done on the three main pillars of accurate woodworking. That is accurate marking up, accurate sawing, and in this video we're going to look at sharpening, how you can sharpen the edges of your tools to raise the sharpness. So that you feel that you can do this at home, I've bought a set of chisels that I'm going to use to show you how, using a really simple process, you can bring them from the manufacturer's state, which is quite crude, to the level of sharpness I think you need for accurate carpentry. You can also use the same technique to bring second-hand tools to the level of sharpness you need for chiseling or planing. You'll have probably discovered that sharpening is quite a big subject by now, and what I've done is to separate the process into two separate videos. In this one, I look at how to sharpen a new chisel to raise the sharpness using wet and dry paper, and in the second video I'm going to look at doing the same thing with a plane iron and then taking that on to making a strop that can take the level of sharpness up to a much higher level, and finally using an oil stone to maintain the cutting edge on your tools once you've got to that standard. These are the chisels that I bought, and here's the plane iron that we're going to sharpen later. The reason I bought this particular make of chisels was firstly because they match the ones I use on my weekend woodwork classes, so I can make use of them. Secondly, I find handles this shape really ergonomic and comfortable to use. You get really good feedback from the tool while you're using it. And the main reason though was the claims that the manufacturer makes about how they're produced. And we'll have a little look at that so that you have an idea of what you might look out for if you're buying a set of chisels. The information that I found on the back of the blister pack that gave me the confidence to buy this set of chisels was this, and it says that the chisel blade is made from drop forged chrome vanadium steel, which has been hardened and tempered. And that's a bit of a mouthful, I know, but just taking it one by one, forging process is a hammering process that's done on the steel when it's in a plastic state, when it's heated to an orange sort of heat. And the process means that the grain structure, the microscopic structure of the chisel blade has been made to be homogeneous, so there are no faults in it. And as a result, when I use the blade, it's not going to crack or chip. The fact that it's made from chrome vanadium steel rather than any other steel tells me that it's the correct steel for a cutting tool. And lastly, the heat treatment process of hardening and tempering tells me that when I sharpen the tool, it's going to keep its cutting edge for as long as I can reasonably expect. And those three factors might be something that you look for when you buy your first set of chisels. So, having had a good look at the packaging, a really good look, hope it wasn't too tedious, we'll open the package up and set to work on sharpening one of these chisels. I think for the purpose of this exercise, I'm going to work on the 1/2-inch chisel because it's going to take me a little less time to grind down whatever I need to, and you'll see the principle, which is the important thing. So we'll take that out and we'll have a look and see what we've got. So underneath the safety cap, we can see that we've got a reasonably finely ground top surface, a reasonably finely ground primary angle, and a secondary angle on there too. The only thing that I've just noticed about that is maybe some of these angles are a little bit off 90 degrees. So I'll get a square on it and see which of these two lines is off 90 degrees to the edge of the chisel. The secondary bevel is just slightly off, and at this end maybe a whisker off too. No, that looks reasonably okay, but it's not quite at 90 degrees, so we're going to have to correct that in the process. If we have a look at the underside, we can see that this is reasonably roughly ground too, and in order to get a really sharp edge on this, what we have to achieve is a mirror finish on this surface and a mirror finish on that secondary bevel. The next thing I need to check is at what angle this primary bevel is, or the grinding angle. Primary bevel, grinding angle, secondary bevel, sharpening angle, just to get you wrapped around the terminology. So let's just check what angle this primary bevel is. I've got a rather natty angle measurer here, if I can remember how to switch it on. And we'll set it to 25 degrees. This is what it should be. There you go. And we'll see how that corresponds to what we have here. And I don't know whether you can see, but that is not what that angle is. There's a gap at the front edge of that. It looks though it's more at 30, so let's try that. And we'll try it again, see how we're doing, making sure that I'm sitting that angle measurer correctly. And that is pretty much what we have, a 30-degree angle on there, which would be great. If it was going to be used as a mortise chisel, a 30-degree angle would be fine for that. It's a bit more robust than a 25-degree angle. And by the time you put a sharpening angle on there, if this is 30 degrees, then you'd probably need that to be 35 degrees, something like that. That would be a robust edge to chop through grain. But I think because this is going to be a general purpose chisel, we'll change that angle from 30 degrees to 25, and our secondary bevel will make 30 degrees. So here's the setup. We've got a non-slip mat that you can get for about £6 for a bigger meterage than I have here, so cheap as chips. I've got a 6mm piece of glass that was originally the sliding doors out of a bookcase, but you can get from your glass merchants for a similar sort of price to the mat, about £6, and that's including grinding the edges to keep it safe. I've got my 1/2-inch chisel. I've got some double-sided tape to stick the wet and dry paper down with. This particular wet and dry is 120 grit. I've also got a 6mm piece of MDF onto which I have stuck some 1000 grit wet and dry paper. I've got some gloves because it's a messy business and there's no point in spending £80 on nail extensions if your hands are going to get filthy, so rubber gloves for me. An engineer's tri-square that I'm going to use to check that I'm sticking to that 90 degrees to the edge of the chisel with that cutting edge. Some paper towel to mop up excess water and a sponge for the same purpose. I've got a draper honing guide that tells me on the end of it exactly what projection I need for both plane blades and chisels, so that's useful information to have. And I've transferred that information onto a little piece of plywood, knowing that I need a 30mm projection for a sharpening angle and a 40mm projection for a grinding angle. And if I make sure that the blade touches that line, it's a repeatable distance that I can do over and over again. I need water. This is in excess of what you need to have. Any old disused spray bottle will do. And now we're ready to give it a go. And the first thing I'm going to do is to have a look at the underside of the chisel and transform this rather rough ground surface into something that's more of a mirror finish. So to start with, I'm using 1000 grit. Now there are those people who'd say that that's not fine enough for really sharp chisels, but it depends what school of thought you belong to. To me, 1000 grit is plenty fine enough to get a finish that I need to be able to shade with, and that's all I want to go to really. So being wet and dry, we'll make it wet. The clue's in the word wet. And I'm going to be very careful not to allow this part of the chisel to get on top of the wet and dry, because I want it to be totally flat, and what I must never do is to lift that chisel for any reason so that this isn't a completely flat surface. So I'm going to be very watchful to make sure that it's only the flat surface that stays on the wet and dry. So you'll hear a lot of talk about stones and mechanical devices to get your tools sharp. I honestly believe that this wet and dry method, once you've got the hang of it, is as good as anything, and I really recommend it. coming, and what I'm liking the look of is that I can see that this end here is not going to take ages to get to a mirror finish. I've got a mirror finish here, mirror finish there, a bit of a dippy area there, but that's going to come up okay. It can take quite a long time to get there, but that's not going to take too long. I'm putting pressure on the end of the chisel so that it's that's getting abraded as much as the rest of the surface. See, it's coming. I'm going to continue until I get rid of all these lines, and then I'll know that that's as good as I need it to be. If I don't get rid of those lines, what will happen is that the sharp edge of the chisel will end up having little dents in it, and a perfectly sharp edge is a dead straight line joining the two surfaces, the sharpening angle and the back of the chisel. And anything less than that and you're going to end up with a less than sharp blade. Still some work to do. Put a bit more water on so that we're flooding away any slurry from underneath. And in a minute I think I might turn around the wet and dry paper so that I've got some fresh surface there to use. Let's turn it around and see what goes on. Don't need too much water. If you want to look after your carpets, there's no need to have it swimming. Just enough to keep the metal particles from sticking in the grit. The longer your strokes, the less effort you have to put in, so that's not a bad thing to remember. Nearly there. I'll turn it round. That's the beauty of having the board the same size as the wet and dry paper. You can get to all four sides of it. Just one little mark here we need to get rid of. That is one of the disadvantages of wet and dry paper, that you can tear it. But when you consider that for I think about £8 you can get a selection of wet and dry paper of different grits. I think 10 sheets for £8, something like that, so about 80p a sheet. And that's a whole heap cheaper than a Japanese waterstone that does exactly the same thing. You're just looking for a rough surface that is harder than the steel that you are sharpening. And whether that's an Arkansas stone or an India oil stone or any other manufactured surface like diamond stones or whatever, that's all you're doing. I actually on my courses use diamond stones to, well, I don't use them on my courses, I sharpen the tools for my courses on diamond stones, and it was worth the very hefty expense for me to do that because I have to do a lot of sharpening. But I think if I was you and working for myself and not having to sharpen more than a couple of chisels and a plane iron, I'd stick to this until you're sure of what you really want. Maybe I had a India oil stone for most of my woodworking life, and that did me really well. And the beauty of an India oil stone over any other sort of stone is that it's quite hard and it doesn't dip, because the disadvantage of using any sort of stone is that you have to dress them every so often because they wear away. But an India oil stone tends to keep its flatness for longer, in my experience. Still got a little bit of work to do on that. We'll keep on going. And that's nearly there. Just having a really good look to make sure there's nothing left. But you can see there's just a really tiny little bit there that I've got to get rid of. I know that sounds a little bit finicky, but honestly, you've only got to do this side once, and it's worth getting it dead right. Otherwise, you haven't got that mirror finish that we want all the way across the back. And we are looking for close to perfection for this. I don't know whether you can hear that helicopter, police helicopter flying overhead. It's dustbin day and I reckon somebody's put something wrong in the recycling. Hasn't washed out that sardine can that they should have done. Still there, can you see? Just slightly. There's a little bit here too. Come on, we can do it. It's gone. Good. Well, I don't know about you, but I can't see that anymore. It looks pretty good. Great. So that's the first bit over. And now what I've got to do is to set about changing this secondary bevel to 30 degrees and this primary bevel to 25 degrees, and obviously we're going to do the primary bevel first of all because that doesn't have to be too smooth. It can be 120 degrees, would be fine for that. We'll get rid of that and dry the surface. And we'll stick the wet and dry paper to the glass. With finer grit paper you can get away with surface tension of the water, but the backing on this 120 is just a little bit thick. Oh, one thing I ought to show you is that this chisel isn't sharp before we start. Now I don't know whether I've made any difference just having a look at the back there, but if I try and shave with it, it's not actually shaving me. Can you see? It's not much coming off, if anything. No, it's not. It's too blunt. And we'll try that when we finish with it, and you'll find that I will be able to shave with it. I'm just going to smooth that down, keeping it nice and flat so it doesn't crinkle up ahead of the blade. Great. And now we can set it up in our honing guide. And there are two positions on this honing guide. The first position is for plane irons, and they would go in that way on it. And the second position, which is inside the guide here, is for chisels. And that's the reason why you've got a different projection for chisels as opposed to plane irons, because the chisel is closer to the wheel, therefore that angle will be different to a plain blade which would be up here. So the projection I need for this is 40 millimeters, and the way I'm going to achieve that is by holding my piece of wood up against the honing guide and just making sure that that chisel end is dead on that 40 millimeter mark. Tighten that up, it's on the 40, which is good. Is it settled inside the guide? Not quite. Just check it. Still okay. And so I can just tighten it up by hand. But important that it is sitting nice and flat in that guide. And that looks good to me. So we'll wet it. And I've got to be really careful that I don't tilt this over so that I get rid of that 90 degrees. It's not quite right as I said earlier, but I certainly don't want to make it worse. So I'm just going to take my time. I'm putting my fingers quite close to the end of the blade. My grip is symmetrical so that it's easy for me to put the same amount of pressure on each side of the chisel, and I'm using the whole length of the wet and dry paper. And if I have a look at that, I can see that I'm just pressing slightly harder on the left hand side than the right hand side. So I want to correct that before I go any further. So I've got to press a little harder on the right hand side of the chisel. So tilt it over a bit. And have another look before we get any further. Like everything else, the more you look, the better it is, because you can see mistakes before they get too bad. So that's getting better. It looks like it's rocking a little bit. It should be a straight line across there. So I'm going to just take action not to continue to rock it, if that's what I'm doing. Still pressing a bit harder on this side than that side, so pressing more on the left I need to. It's looking better. Coming along nicely. I could still do with pressing a little more evenly, so I'm going to press a little harder on the right this time, on this side. Now the wider the chisel, the easier it is to keep it balanced. But now you can see I'm down to that secondary bevel. It didn't take long to get there, but that secondary bevel is now even along that front edge. So I've succeeded in keeping that 90 degrees, or what was 90 degrees. But if you have a look at this angle here, it looks a bit off 90 degrees, that angle, but it could be that this top facet is slightly crooked, so I won't beat myself up too much over that. I've got to go a bit further until I can feel a burr on the back there. You can see why it's worth having quite a coarse grit on this. You don't want to spend forever getting rid of metal, and to get maximum use out of your energy, you may as well have a reasonably coarse grit. Those scratches on there are no deeper than the grinding marks that were there originally, so we're not doing the chisel any harm. A bit more pressure on the right. I'm going to turn the glass round, I think, so I can make a bit like I did before. I'm going to make use of those side bits. And now we're there. We've got rid of that secondary bevel, and I can feel a burr just coming up underneath there, so that's perfect. I'm just going to take it out of the honing guide, and the first thing I got to do is to take that burr off with 1000 grit wet and dry, so that when I get to the next stage I know that the new burr has appeared and it's not just the old one sitting there. So we'll get the 1000 grit wet and dry. Take that burr off. Keep it nice and flat. Yep, that's gone. And I'm just going to check I've got that 90 degrees right. And I'm going to dry my fingers because I don't want to get water over my engineer's tri-square. And that's pretty good. That is pretty spot on 90 degrees. So what I'll do now is to put the chisel back into the honing guide. Make sure you got the square end rather than the rounded end with the chisel sticking out through it. And this time we're going to just put that to 30 millimeters, which will make the angle slightly more acute. So put it to 30. Check that it's settled in the guide, which it wasn't. So we'll check it again. That looks good. Pop that up. And we're going to go back to our 1000 grit wet and dry. And it doesn't matter that this is a bit worn because it'll just make it that much more polished. So settling it on there, making sure we're not rocking it. I'm just going to take a very slight amount of metal away, just sufficient to get that new bevel on there. Can you see? Now, as much as it pains me, I'm going to have to take my gloves off because I'm going to have to feel for burrs, and I can't do that through those gloves. So I should be able to feel a burr, and I can. That's got a burr all the way across. So I take it out of the guide, put it flat on the wet and dry, making sure I don't lift it, and I just get rid of that burr. So you can see we've got the secondary bevel, a very, very thin line there at 30 degrees, and the primary bevel, which is the major surface there, at 25 degrees. I've got no burr on the back, I've got a polished edge here, so I've got a polished surface meeting a polished surface at 30 degrees, which is what sharpening is all about. And now I'm very confident that I should be able to shave with it. Even take my watch off, just so that you can see. Right. And there we are. Don't recommend that you do this too far around the inside of your arm, or shave it in the morning, but that is doing the job. That is sharp enough to shave with. Now I'm going to improve that even more in a minute, but in the meantime I'm going to have a go at that plane iron and show you that the process is exactly the same. Well, I really hope that you found that video informative, but on the basis that you can have too much of a good thing, and also you're probably desperate for a cup of tea, I'm going to save the most exciting bit, which is the sharpening of the plane iron, to tutorial 4, the next video. And in tutorial 4 I'll also be showing you how to make a leather strop that you can use in conjunction with some polishing soap to take those sharpened edges to a whole new level. If you've enjoyed this video, don't forget to give it a thumbs up, and if you'd like to subscribe, there's a little subscribe button at the bottom there that you can use. In the meantime, see you in the next video.